You know how sometimes you hear about people who just vanish into thin air? No explanation, no warning signs, nothing. It's like they were never there to begin with. Well, I'm here to tell you a story about one of those people. A girl named Lacey Fletcher, who was just an ordinary kid from Louisiana, or so it seemed. Lacey grew up in the small town of Slaughter, Louisiana. Yes, that's actually its name. It's a place where everyone knows each other, and nothing ever seems to happen. But beneath the surface, something was brewing in the Fletcher household. Lacey's parents, Sheila and Clay, seemed like loving caregivers at first. They'd take her to church on Sundays, and she'd smile for family photos. But as she grew older, things began to change. Lacey started having health issues that required her to stay home from school more often than not. People in town would say things like, "Lacey's just a sensitive child," or "she needs extra care." But what they didn't know was that Lacey's parents were slowly turning her into a prisoner in their own home. The last time anyone outside the Fletcher family saw Lacey was at church on Easter Sunday 2008. She looked pale and fragile, but no one suspected a thing. It was just another ordinary day in Slaughter, Louisiana. But behind closed doors, something was festering. Lacey's parents had become increasingly controlling, isolating her from the world and denying her basic medical care. They'd take her to the doctor only when absolutely necessary, and even then, they'd lie about her condition to avoid drawing attention to themselves. It wasn't until 2022 that the truth finally came out. Emergency responders received a call from Lacey's parents reporting a sick person at their home. When they arrived, they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives: Lacey's rotting body, fused to her couch after more than a decade of isolation and suffering. I know it sounds like a nightmare, but this is real. This actually happened to the young girl, who was just an ordinary kid from Louisiana, until she wasn't. And now, I'm left wondering, what if someone had spoken up sooner? What if we'd listened to the whispers of doubt and suspicion that surrounded the Fletcher family all those years ago? But in the end, it's not about what ifs. It's about taking action when we see something that doesn't feel right. You're at the unseen circle, and this is the story of Lacey Fletcher. A cautionary tale of medical neglect, abuse, and the devastating consequences of ignoring our instincts. Lacey Fletcher. Just a name, but it's etched into my mind like a scar. She was born into this perfect family in Slaughter, Louisiana. Her parents, Sheila and Clay, were pillars of the community, churchgoers, good neighbors, and loving parents. Lacey's childhood was marked by innocence and joy. She attended Brownfields Baptist School, where she excelled academically and socially. Teachers and peers described her as vibrant, smart. Can you imagine? A kid who loved country music, Disney movies. Mariah Carey was her jam. I know it sounds trivial now, but just hear me out. But Lacey wasn't like the other kids her age. She had this uniqueness about her. Her parents encouraged friendships with the other kids, often hosting playdates at their home. It was like they were trying to create this perfect little world for their daughter. And it worked for a while. Then, around 14 or 15, Lacey started exhibiting signs of social anxiety and behavioral changes. Her parents pulled her out of public school to homeschool her. Now, I don't know if she received an official diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, which, by the way, is a form of autism that make people face significant difficulties in social interaction and nonverbal communication, along with restricted repetitive patterns of behavior and interests. But it was the beginning of the end. Homeschooling, it's like a slow, moving fog that crept into Lacey's life. She became withdrawn, rarely leaving the house or interacting with others. Neighbors and friends who had grown accustomed to seeing her in public noticed a significant change in her behavior after she stopped attending school. They'd see her occasionally, but even that was becoming rare. And then there were the parents, Sheila and Clay. They became increasingly protective and restrictive, at least this is what was apparent to others, limiting Lacey's interactions with friends and family members. It was like they were trying to hide her from the world, and in doing so, they were suffocating her. Neighbors like Robert Blades remembered Lacey as a fun girl who loved playing with the other kids. But after she started homeschooling, he noticed a change. She was a recluse, he said. I never saw that side of her again. You see, it's not just about Lacey, it's about what happened to her. She vanished from public view, leaving behind a trail of questions and confusion. What drove her parents to isolate her? Shame, something more sinister. I've been thinking about this case a lot lately, trying to piece together the puzzle of how Sheila and Clay Fletcher managed to keep their secret hidden for so long. It's like they were living two separate lives, one in front of everyone, and another behind closed doors. They were respected members of the local government, church activities, and social gatherings. Sheila was a town alderman, an assistant to the city prosecutor. She was everywhere. And Clay, he had his own job, but he'd always check in every day like clockwork. They were the perfect couple, or so it seemed. But what really gets me is how they managed to keep Lacey trapped at home while maintaining this respected public image. It's like a sick game of cat and mouse, where they played the part of loving parents in front of everyone, all while suffocating their own daughter behind closed doors. Sheila would often post photos on Facebook of her attending town planning and zoning committee meetings or church activities with Lacey by her side, but those were just props, a way to show the world that everything was fine. Meanwhile, Lacey was stuck at home alone with no one to talk to. And it's not like they were subtle about it either. They'd often have social gatherings at their home, and Lacey would be there, but she'd never interact with anyone. It was like she was a ghost, invisible and inaudible. But Sheila and Clay would always make sure to include her in the photos, just so everyone could see that they were a happy family. But what really gets me is how they justified Lacey's absence to others. They'd say things like, "She's homeschooled," or "She's not feeling well." But no one ever suspected that she was being neglected, that she was trapped in her own home with no way out. They perfected their little facade, and everyone bought it. They were the perfect family, the kind of people you'd want to invite over for dinner. But behind closed doors, it was a nightmare. It's really hard to even try to imagine what it must have been like for her. Living in those conditions for over a decade, it's just unimaginable. It all started when Lacey was still a young girl. Her parents, Sheila and Clay, claimed that she had become increasingly reclusive, refusing to leave the couch or take care of herself. They said she'd been like this since her teenage years, but I'm not buying it. There's got to be more to the story. Lacey Fletcher didn't just die on that couch. She became a part of it. Her body was physically fused to the fabric, her flesh rotting into the upholstery, binding her to it like a human wax figure left in the sun. When emergency responders arrived, they found a nightmare beyond comprehension. The remains of a woman who had not moved from that spot in at least 12 years. By the time she was discovered, her body was covered in open, festering sores, with some so deep they exposed raw bone and muscle tissue. Her own bodily fluids, blood, pus, and waste, had soaked through the couch, rotting the wood beneath her. The surrounding floorboards had begun to decay, eaten away by years of accumulated urine, feces, and decomposition. Investigators described the stench as so overwhelming that seasoned paramedics ran outside to vomit. Even the coroner, who had seen decades of death and decay, admitted he could not eat for a week after seeing the state she was in. Lacey had essentially been sitting in a pool of her own bodily waste for over a decade. The cushions beneath her were saturated with urine, feces, sweat, and infection, creating a biological swamp that became a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. The stench of ammonia and rotting flesh was so intense that first responders had to take breaks from the scene just to breathe the fresh air. Her lower body, especially from the waist down, had atrophied to the point of near mummification. Her legs were crossed in a contorted position, indicating that she had been stuck like that for years, unable to stretch, shift, or move at all. The once healthy tissue on her back, buttocks, and thighs had eroded away, replaced by massive ulcers, some of which tunneled deep into her body, exposing the skeletal structure beneath. Her hip bones were practically poking through her flesh. Maggots were reportedly found feeding on her open wounds, something that could only happen to a body left to rot for weeks. Except Lacey was alive through it all. The sepsis that ultimately killed had been years in the making, a slow, agonizing process where her body essentially began digesting itself as her organs shut down one by one. Meanwhile, her parents went on with their lives as if nothing was happening. They still attended church, smiled at neighbors, and even went on weekend getaways, leaving their daughter to rot in that couch, utterly helpless, starving, and trapped. After the case went public, speculation ran wild about whether Lacey suffered from locked-in syndrome, a rare neurological condition that leaves a person mentally aware but physically paralyzed, unable to move anything except their eyes. This theory was pushed by her parents and their defense team, who suggested that Lacey was trapped in her own body and couldn't physically leave the couch even if she wanted to. But this was a complete fabrication. According to the official autopsy and medical reports, Lacey did not have locked-in syndrome. She had been diagnosed only with autism and severe social anxiety, neither of which would have caused full-body paralysis. The coroner himself dismissed the locked-in syndrome claim, stating, "I don't know where that term came from or what source it came from. In all my years as a practicing physician, I have never heard of that term being applied to Lacey Fletcher." So, if Lacey wasn't paralyzed, why didn't she move? Why didn't she try to escape? The horrific reality is that she was neglected into complete immobility. Years of starvation and lack of movement caused her muscles to waste away through severe atrophy. Her tendons stiffened and contracted, locking her body into the cross-legged position she was found in. Her spine hunched forward, her limbs locked in place, and any attempt to move would have likely caused agonizing pain due to deep, untreated infections eating away at her flesh. The real reason she couldn't leave that wasn't medical. It was psychological and environmental abuse. Her parents, Sheila and Clay Fletcher, had deprived her of medical care for over a decade, kept her confined to the same position for so long that her body adapted to being immobile, failed to provide food and water, leading to extreme malnutrition and further muscle deterioration. Lacey's weight at the time of her death was just 96 pounds, horrifically underweight for a grown woman. Her bones had become brittle, her organs had shrunk, and her immune system had collapsed. And yet her parents tried to claim that this was her choice. They argued that Lacey preferred staying on the couch and that she chose not to eat, move, or seek medical attention. This defense was laughable at best and monstrous at worst. The reality was simple: Lacey did not have locked-in syndrome. She was not physically paralyzed. She was abandoned, abused, and neglected into a state where she could no longer function as a human being. Sheila and Clay Fletcher had 12 years to seek medical help, call a doctor, or ask for assistance. Instead, they let their daughter rot to death in their own home while they continued living normal lives, treating her as nothing more than a discarded piece of furniture. It was not a medical condition that trapped Lacey. It was them. Sheila finally called 911, claiming Lacey had stopped breathing. But when paramedics arrived at the house, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The smell was the first thing that hit them, an unbearable stench of rot and decay. "It's like nothing I've ever smelled before. It's like someone took all the worst parts of death and concentrated them into one sickening odor." As they made their way inside, they were met with a sight that would make even the most seasoned responders sick to their stomachs. Lacey was sitting on the couch, her body twisted in an unnatural position. It looked like she'd been there for years, not days. Her skin was gray and decaying, her eyes sunken into her skull. The paramedics were shocked. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, later said that she felt like she was in some kind of nightmare, like she'd stumbled into a horror movie or something. She described the smell as overwhelming and the sight as horrific. The coroner, Dr. Baum, was called to the scene, and he's been quoted as saying that this was the worst thing he'd ever seen. Even after 30 years of practicing medicine, he said it was like Lacey had been forgotten, left to rot on her couch for who knows how long. Law enforcement responded quickly, but they were unprepared for what they found. They'd heard rumors about the Fletchers, but nothing could have prepared them for this. They were met with a scene of unimaginable neglect, a house that was literally crawling with flies and infested with rodents. As they began to process the evidence, it became clear that Lacey had been unable to move or care for herself for years. There were no signs of recent activity, no food left out, no trash cans overflowing, just silence. And then there were the personal care items, baby wipes, lotions, and medicines. It was like Sheila was trying to create a false narrative that Lacey had refused care, but she'd been making an effort to take care of herself. But it was all a lie, a desperate attempt to avoid accountability for what they'd done. The evidence spoke for itself. Lacey's body was a testament to the horrific neglect she'd suffered at the hands of her own parents. And as law enforcement continued to investigate, it became clear that Sheila and Clay had been planning this for years, hiding their secret behind a facade of normalcy. It's just so hard to understand how people can do what they did to Lacey. It's like they're not even human anymore. Like they've lost all sense of compassion, all sense of decency. Lacey's body was a ravaged shell of its former self, a testament to years of unimaginable suffering. The autopsy report said that she died from severe medical negligence, which resulted in chronic malnutrition, acute hunger, immobility, acute ulcer development, osteomyelitis. It's like a never-ending list of horrors. And it all adds up to one thing: her parents had been systematically starving and neglecting her for years. The forensic experts estimated that she hadn't moved from the couch in at least 12 years. Can you even imagine? She was literally rotting away, stuck to the sofa like some kind of human statue, while her parents were living their lives, completely unaware of what was happening right under their noses. Now, I know some people have said that Lacey might have had locked-in syndrome, a condition where you're aware of everything around you but can't move or respond. But the coroner disputed this claim, saying that she only had autism and social anxiety. And let me tell you, it's not like her parents didn't know about her conditions. They knew all right, they just chose to ignore them. And as a result, Lacey suffered for 2 decades, unable to move or care for herself. After Lacey's death, it all came crashing down. Sheila and Clay were arrested on charges of second-degree murder. Can you believe it? They had been neglecting their daughter for years, starving her to death, and they still managed to spin this as if it was somehow her fault. They claimed that Lacey chose to stay on the couch, like she had some kind of agency in the matter. They even went so far as to say that she had a deep-seated desire for solitude. It's sick, man, just sick. The public was outraged when they were released on a $300,000 bond. I mean, can you imagine? These people were responsible for their daughter's death, and yet they're walking free, like nothing happened. It was like the justice system had lost all sense of reality. But that wasn't even the worst part. In 2023, some technicality resulted in their charges being dropped. I don't know what kind of loophole they found, but it's just infuriating. The district attorney vowed to have them re-indicted, but for now, they're free as birds. Their defense team argued that the prosecution couldn't prove intent, like it was some kind of accident or something. But come on, man. These people knew exactly what they were doing. They starved their daughter to death, and then they had the nerve to try and justify it. The district attorney wasn't having it. He said that the evidence was clear. Sheila and Clay had intentionally neglected Lacey, leading to her death, and he vowed to make sure justice was served. As of now, they're facing charges of second-degree murder, and their trial is set to begin soon. If convicted, they could be looking at life in prison, which, honestly, can't even begin to punish them for what they did to Lacey. The public is still outraged. People are calling for harsher penalties, saying that the Fletchers should face even more severe charges. And I don't blame them. This case has raised some serious questions about child protection laws and caregiver accountability. We need to be doing more to protect our children from abuse, especially when it's happening at home, where they're supposed to feel safe. The Fletchers' actions are a stark reminder of just how broken our system can be. But beyond the horror of their case, I think Lacey deserves to be remembered as a victim, not just a statistic. She was a human being who deserved love and care, and her parents took that away from her. To hear, that's all I've got, so I guess see you soon.